It is Monday, December 18th, 2017 at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Admissions Live. I'm your host, Adam Castro. On today's live broadcast, we are counting down the biggest college admissions stories of the year with Eric Hoover and Jon Boeckenstedt. Admissions Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Be part of our live broadcast by sharing your knowledge. Participate in today's discussion by tweeting us using hashtag HigherEdLive. All of our episodes are free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com, or take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast in iTunes. Are you an enrollment management or admission professional who works with digital content and marketing? If so, M. Stoner's Digital Marketing for Higher Education online conference is for you. Sessions will address content marketing to recruit students, how to use social listening to identify strategic influencers, search engine optimization, and more. We'll be tweeting out a link to learn more about this conference shortly. Admissions Live is sponsored by NRCC UA, producers of the weekly EduVentures Wake Up Call newsletter. Subscribe and get weekly updates on the most pressing issues and trends in higher education. Well, I'm really excited about this episode, my year-end episode for Admissions Live, and I could not be more excited about my guests today that really need no introduction, but we'll certainly give them an opportunity to introduce themselves to the Higher Ed Live audience. Many of you know them certainly from their work in the field, but also social media as well. I can't encourage our listeners today enough to write in with questions. If you have questions for Jon and Eric, using hashtag HigherEdLive, I'll try to get to those and get those to the appropriate person during today's episode. But gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. I want to give you guys just a quick chance to introduce yourself. So Jon, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Hi to everybody out in internet land. I'm Jon Boeckenstedt. I am Associate Vice President of Enrollment Management and Marketing at DePaul University in Chicago. I've been in the profession and related professions for about 35 years, and worked at 5 different colleges and universities, from highly selective to not selective at all. So I think I have a really interesting take on the landscape, and happy to field questions today.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Jon, for joining us. Eric, please.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Jon. Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Hoover. I'm a reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education, where I've been since 2001, and for some reason they keep paying me. I focus mostly on admissions, student recruitment, testing, enrollment issues, all that good stuff. When I first started at the Chronicle, I thought higher education would be really boring. But I was wrong about that. And I would say, I don't know, 4 days out of 5, I have a great time at least. Thanks for having me on. I welcome any questions, any and all questions as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys. And you know, obviously, if you follow Eric and Jon on Twitter, you know that you kind of, everybody secretly wants to be a part of their, you know, their lineup of tweets. And I definitely want to be, you know, the overheard in a coffee shop or overheard in the office of admission tweet at least one time for Eric by the time my career is over. So hopefully I'll be able to have that opportunity.
All right.
So today, you know, we got a ton of feedback about this episode from, you know, professionals all over the country in terms of what we should talk about as the biggest stories in admissions in 2017. And thankfully, you know, Eric and Jon have done a lot of this work for us because they've both written on several of these topics that we're going to discuss today, and certainly have a lot of background on a couple of the issues that really have come to the forefront in 2017. And we're going to kind of break this up into chunks and into sections, but certainly one of the biggest stories of the year, stories plural of the year, certainly revolves around college access. There's been a ton of talk about race-conscious admissions. There's been, you know, even more talk than the last couple of years about test-optional admissions, and defining first-generation students and what that means on campuses across the country. So I wanted to open it to you guys, and maybe Jon, you can kind of start the discussion here about those kind of 3 topics and how they evolve this year in higher ed.
Sure. I think the 3, as you indicated, are all sort of tightly connected to one another. And I'd like to, for whatever amount I can, take credit for some of it. I've been doing data visualization for a long time, and made it a point to point out that the most selective institutions in the country are oftentimes the very worst when it comes to enrolling low income and especially Pell Grant students. And it's become a fairly hot topic over the past, I guess, 5 years or so, partially, I think, because of public pressure and focus, but also because of the economy and the fact that there are far more students who need more financial aid today and who are being shut out of a college education than there were even 5 years ago, while at the same time college costs continue to rise. And you can't really disaggregate and disassociate those two. So there are issues of, how do we find not just the students who have always looked like they're going to be successful college material, but how do we identify and how do we define talent among high school students and try to find out who has the greatest potential to do more in college. It's not just a matter of selecting those people who are destined to graduate, but shouldn't we as higher education institutions be attempting to make the world a better place by finding the best qualified people, however we decide to define that, and ensure to whatever extent we can that those students have access to education.
So I guess my question would be, what's stopping us from doing this, right? What's stopping the elites? Is it incorrect strategy? We hear stories, and Eric, certainly jump in here. We hear stories all the time in the Chronicle and other outlets about how XYZ University was able to increase diversity, increase enrollment from Pell eligible students from year 1 to year 2. So the stories are out there, but on a whole, it doesn't look like we're doing enough, in this area. So what's the disconnect there?
Well, I think, Adam, one disconnect is depending on which campus you're asking that question on, you'll get very different answers. John and I were at a conference some years ago where, an admissions dean from a very prominent university on the East Coast said that, the institution would be happy to enroll more low-income students, first-generation students, if only it could find more of them who are capable of doing the work. That's a rough paraphrase, but that is the gist of it. And I've been struck by the echoes of that sentiment on at least some campuses, even as on many others when I visit or visit by phone. I hear a lot about how often many of these students can do the work, do the work. And so I have to ask myself skeptically, what explains that? And I think one of many answers is just a question of priorities. When you're talking, for instance, about a very small school that must hit many, many boxes and enroll, say, X number of legacies, for instance, then the question of priorities kind of takes hold. I also think there's, on some campuses, a real deep devotion to standardized tests, either because people think that standardized test scores tell them a whole lot, or they are kind of clinging to a system in which having a large proportion of students with really, really high test scores is in and of itself kind of like a goal or a way of kind of proving your excellence. John, I know you have other thoughts, but I think on some campuses there's just a downright lack of kind of creative thinking or a willingness to really embrace this as a goal.
Yeah, the comment or the quote that Eric led off with was this dean of admissions at this certainly a name everybody would recognize university said that she and her staff spend, and this is a quote, all of our time looking for low-income students, which we define as families with under $60,000 in annual income. And it struck me as really odd because more than half of the families in the country have family incomes of under $60,000, because at that time the median income was about $55,000. And what struck me as strange was not the fact that she said it, but the fact that she said it so easily and it came past her lips almost without a second thought made me believe that that was sort of the embedded code at that institution, that's something a lot of people there believed. And as Eric said, if you measure qualifications for admission based on who has advantage and privilege and access to the good schools and AP courses and test tutors, what you'll find is that you tend to believe the rhetoric after a while, that only those students can be successful at your university. I think anybody who's done admissions for more than a few years knows that you run into amazing students all the time who don't look like they're going to be academic superstars, but really need something better and more challenging and more intriguing than what their high school is offering them. So once they get into an environment where they can be challenged and their minds stretch, they really take off. Those don't always show up on a standardized test where you're bubbling in the correct answer out of 4 given to you.
One of the terms that I've been hearing a lot is in college admissions is risk averse. You know, these admission officers are risk averse. They don't want to necessarily take a risk on a student. So to offer a student admission that, you know, isn't a legacy, that isn't, you know, attached to some program, they're treading very lightly, and they're just not taking a risk on a student that shows motivation, that shows the skills, that may not have the standardized test scores. And I think this lends itself really well into this idea of test optional admissions and where this movement is going. I mean, I know it's gathering momentum. Having gone through it this year, my institution just went test optional for the first time for the fall 2018 class. And we do it for very different ways. They're very different reasons. You know, we're an access institution. We're not looking for reasons to decline admission for a student. And what we saw was, it was, you know, the statistics were all there. I mean, high school GPA was driving, you know, first semester performance, and first semester performance was driving retention and eventually graduation rates. And it was really that simple. And, you know, being from an institution that, you know, is a 70% Pell institution, that's minority majority, you know, we were able to identify these students in pretty large groups and to see that this is what was moving the needle, and it was only right for us to move in this direction. Now, I know the decision is much different at other institutions, but it seems like standardized testing is certainly a barrier to improving college access across the country. So, Jon, certainly your thoughts about where the movement stands today, and what are the pros and cons being debated on both sides for schools that are looking at this as a potential option?
Well, I think the reason colleges and universities, first of all, are risk averse is that if you take a big risk and you're successful in higher education, it's not too hard for other institutions to duplicate it pretty quickly. So the success that you experience gets spread around to other colleges pretty rapidly. On the other hand, if what you attempt is risky and it's a catastrophic fail, you bear all of the risk and all of the cost of whatever happens. So test optional for us was one of those things where it became crystal clear once we threw aside our assumptions and talked about our mission and started doing real research. And what we found was that for us, at least, and every institution may be different, so I'm not saying this is a blanket statement, for us and for the students we enrolled and the programs we offered, standardized tests added almost nothing to our understanding of their academic performance in the first year, and really literally nothing beyond that first year. So we knew, and we had experienced for a long time, a lot of students who just didn't look good on paper because they didn't have parents who were college educated, they didn't know the system, their essays weren't as good because they hadn't been writing them since freshman year of high school. Their parents didn't understand how college worked. They came from lower resourced high schools, and in short, they didn't have the advantages of other students in the admissions process. So to judge somebody based on the quality of that application without understanding the context was really a big mistake that we think other institutions are making. There are some people at ACT and the College Board who say, well, more information is good. And that's an easy premise to accept, I think, until you understand the cost of that more information. And it's millions of hours of instruction time lost that are spent preparing for tests. It's a test that is used in ways that no one really ever intended it to be used, to measure the quality of school districts or learning or other sorts of things, to allocate resources to school districts based on test scores. Even the people at the College Board and ACT say that's not appropriate, but it happens all the time. And so when we say more information is better, so we should keep tests, we're forgetting the enormous costs of tests and what that makes us do and how it makes us act and change instruction. And I think for me, there are very few cons to going test optional. There are an awful lot of pros.
Yeah, I think, Adam, just picking up on what Jon said there, I just feel like people outside of higher ed maybe just really can't underestimate how on many campuses, even the will to make a change, a large change, moderate sized change, a small change, in admissions, it might just seem like something that could be done overnight or within a month. And I'm not saying it can't, but recently I was just talking to the VP for enrollment at a college that will soon announce that it's going test optional. And he's given me the blow by blow of how this process had to unfold over about 2 years. Again, every campus is different, but on this one, everyone seemed to be on board. But there was still this process that would be familiar to most anyone who works on a campus. One division wants to make a change, but other folks in other divisions have to sign off on it. In the case of this college, there were a small handful of faculty members who were at least skeptical of the plan or the impetus to go test optional. They were fearful about what it would mean. And so a meeting is planned to deliver the data that made a compelling case, it sounds like. And yet, that meeting took months to pull off. And then there were a couple of very skeptical donors. Yes, just a couple, but their influence was large. And so, it's basically for this one school, a 3-year process to make this one change. And I think, definitely something that was raised as an objection, a concern on this campus was what happens when we lose, do we lose something? Are we saying that we're less serious as an institution because we don't value test scores, which wasn't necessarily what the move was all about, but it was very much the push for test optional on this campus was flowing directly from what Jon just said, a sense of the cost to having this additional information, which data on this one campus suggested strongly wasn't giving the admissions office much, if anything, beyond what they already had from the GPA. But it was just one reminder that it's a slow-moving beast, a college campus on many cases, and even a small handful of people who have concerns can kind of hold up the bus. So I think sometimes there would be more colleges going test optional, and they're held up often by kind of the logistics of making that change. Depending on the campus you're on, it can be a real slow kind of process. And as Jon said, it can be a frightening thing to bring up. You're next on the line as the enrollment VP or admissions dean who pushed this thing if some other enrollment crisis happens down the line.
Right.
And it's, there are two very interesting things. One is that faculty tend to be good testers, and that's usually how they get to be faculty members, because all the things they've done in their life have been driven by the college they got into, the graduate programs they got into, and those are largely driven by test scores, or at least historically have been. And the second issue is that there's a very low false positive on SAT and ACT. And that means if you have a very high score, you're probably not a dummy. You have something going on for you, even if it's just an ability to take standardized tests really well. It does demonstrate some intellectual capacity. What it says and what it means about you is subject to great debate. The problem is when people take that premise and turn it on its ear and say, if you don't have high test scores, you must not be very smart. And that's the big problem with people who over-rely on tests. Their unwillingness to look beyond that score and figure out whether or not there's something going on that's worthwhile in that student's background and record that makes him or her a good potential risk.
And I think, I don't want to speak for Jon, but I don't think this conversation is easy at any campus. I mean, I think my experience was it was as smooth as it could possibly go, but you're talking about 18 months of planning, probably 20 subcommittee meetings, certainly, pitches to the board of trustees, to the full faculty, to make this happen. So I don't think it's an easy discussion at any campus. And I know for a fact, I mean, I have peers in my state, I have public institutions in my state that should have gone test optional years ago, both for, mission purposes, but also for competitive purposes. And the guess is that is somewhere in a faculty or board committee and it can't break through. And, obviously an institution like in that situation is losing time. And, I'm very thankful that we were able to get it done. But I think that's, if these demographic shifts and if this emphasis on college access continues, which I don't think either of them are going to slow down anytime soon, I think those institutions are going to feel more and more pressure to make a call on this, which I think is a good transition into Eric, and something that you wrote last week about these demographic shifts and interviewing an enrollment manager that's talking a lot about, effort doesn't do it anymore. There's only so much you can get just by outworking your competitors at this point. So can you talk a little bit about the current state of demographic shifts in admissions?
Sure, absolutely. And it's not my job to make plugs for books, but I'll pass on that I found this recent book that's just out by Nathan D. Graw, a professor of economics at Carleton College. I found it very useful. It's a region by region drill down on demographic change, and it's kind of a deeper look at changes that anyone in enrollment is familiar with, changes that are well underway, but it slices and dices some of the major storylines, and looking at how they differ among regions and states, and also by institution. One takeaway from the book is that demographic changes that keep so many enrollment folks up at night. Well, guess what? He suggests strongly that the rich are going to get richer, if you will. The most selective, big name institutions, and say in the top 50 U.S. News rankings, by and large, are going to see a growth in demand. And so there you go. Everyone else, as usual, has to juggle multiple headaches. I think so many places when I ask about looming demographic changes, I'm immediately told, "What do you mean looming? They're already falling down. I'm up to my ears in demographic changes." And I think if I got a dozen emails about this piece, 11 of them said, can you send this to my trustees? Can you send this to my president or provost? Because all they want to talk to me about is recruitment. And I'm saying what demographic change means for our institution is that we need to double down even beyond what we already might be doing to think about support services, academic advising, anything that might piece together a stronger kind of retention puzzle for us, that we're not going to be able to recruit our way out of a downturn in high school graduates in our neighborhood. So I think a lot of the stories often focus on what this means at the point of admission for colleges, and obviously that's an important question. But also, what about an institution that's already losing like 25, 30 or more % of its first year students from year one to the next? To the extent that many of those students on a given campus might be first gen, might be underrepresented minorities, might have needs that go beyond those that were maybe traditionally thought about. Is it an opportunity? Yes, but I think that that part of the enrollment cycle is probably on some campuses just continues to be kind of overlooked, not necessarily by the enrollment VP, but by other folks on campus as being a huge part of the puzzle to answering the question, how are we going to survive this downfall?
Yeah, admissions people used to look at the funnel and say if the funnel had more inquiries in it, you'd be better off. And translating that into demographic analysis suggests that you simply look at the number of students who are in your region, and that's going to be a harbinger of things to come. And in some sense it is, but it's really very short-sighted to look just at numbers. Because while in the Northeast and the Midwest, the slope is downward out to, I think, 2027 or 2028, the composition of who's in those high school graduating classes is changing dramatically too. And just from a statistical standpoint, Caucasian and Asian students have a much higher propensity to go to college. African American and Hispanic students a much lower chance. And so the populations that are growing tend to be the ones who have less chance to go to college, and the populations that are shrinking tend to be the ones that go to college at greater rates. So it's a sort of double whammy effect. And then if you think about income, the same people who are less likely to go to college are also affected by poverty and low income far more in this country. And so not only do you have shrinking numbers, you have less orientation toward the idea of going to college in the first place, or if they do have the idea of going to college, they have far less capacity to pay for it. And so that's likely to put a tremendous amount of pressure on community college systems in the future, as people still strive to go to college and still dream to go to college, but find that they're less prepared because of the schools they go to and their academic opportunity that's been given to them and their cultural capital, but also have less ability to pay. So it's really the perfect storm, and it's not good news for people in enrollment management.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think what we're hearing now is what I'm seeing. Schools that are doing it right now are relying less on the funnel and certainly just the general demographics in their recruitment area, but are focusing more on value added to an inquiry, value added certainly to an acceptance letter. So it's not just we're letting you into our prestigious university. It's we want you to come to our college, and by coming to our college, we're going to give you these opportunities. And whether that's tutorial services, whether that's internships, whether that's placement in an honors program or one-on-one work with a faculty member, a lot of that stuff is now being shifted to the front end of the admissions process instead of having the student having to earn that where it may have been the case 10, 20 years ago while they're on campus. So I think we're going to see that continue, but that's also going to kind of sharpen the razors a bit when it comes to the competitive balance in the country. We already have the cafeteria wars and who offers the best food. Now we're going to have, who can offer the best acceptance packet and to attract those students. But I think students will ultimately benefit from that at every part of the demographic scale, I think. And so we'll see how that kind of evolves over the next couple of years. But I definitely want to talk about the verification trap. We talked a lot about college access and how it relates kind of with a negative connotation, and what are the barriers that we're putting in place for students. And certainly financial aid verification is one of those barriers. This is well timed. Eric, you just wrote a fantastic piece that I know is getting a lot of play online in terms of comments and reaction to. So can you kind of take us through what you learned in your research about verification, and particularly as it relates to low-income students?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. So probably like many people I've talked to in admissions, I was certainly aware of this process called financial aid verification, which usually affects about roughly 1 in 3 folks who complete a FAFSA each year. They get a notice, sometimes weeks or months later, that they've been selected for verification. And often, I'm told, I've seen students get these notifications. I've been sitting next to some of them when they receive it. They have no earthly clue what this means. They might think, am I in trouble? Did I do something wrong? Did my parents cheat on their taxes? And the answer is usually no, nobody did anything wrong. But you then have to complete another form, or maybe 6 forms, as the case often might be. And yeah, with regard to low-income students, you are much more likely to be selected for verification by the education department or by an institution if you happen to be from a lower income family, if you are Pell eligible. And so this is just something it's a process that wasn't built to do anyone any harm, but you have to kind of look at the effects or the costs of this on the counseling side of the desk, the side of the desk that students and families sit at, and it causes them, generally speaking, a fair amount of alarm or concern. And it's not just a hassle for many families. It's not just a headache. No one likes filling out extra forms, right? We all hate filling out too many forms, right? It's a time drain. We'd rather be spending our time doing something else. But I think one thing that I really wanted to convey in the story was, for many students, often for the students who have the least help, who have the least kind of college know-how, and who, in many cases, as you know well, Adam and John alike, these are families who might already kind of be on the fence about the whole college proposition. They might already feel a bit iffy about the whole thing, paying for it, but also kind of the cultural, the whole investment in college. And now you have to deal with the IRS. Now you have to get a form that maybe you've never heard of. You have to obtain a document. You're probably going to wait for it. And sometimes these delays can cause a student to lose out on aid, or can send a student and family through a prolonged period of time not knowing what the outcome is going to be, and there might be often money on the line. So I learned that it's more than just kind of a ball of red tape. I mean, it really, despite what the intentions might or might not be for this policy, and there's certainly good ones to make sure the money taxpayer money is going to the right folks in the right amounts, that's something probably most Americans would support, by all means. But the effect of it, especially this year, so many institutions and high schools are seeing their verification selections go off the charts, and people are kind of throwing up their hands saying, what is this worth? How are we going to get all this done? So I think definitely panic from coast to coast in certain offices, just a logistical challenge, but also something that can really make, as you said, Adam, and I quoted you in the story, so thank you. This is a heck of a welcome message to get from a college if you're a low-income first-generation student and you're already kind of thinking like, maybe college isn't for me, and then you get this notification asking you to do something that you don't quite understand. It can be real off-putting, to say the least.
Yeah, I not much to add to that. Eric's article was fantastic. For people who haven't read it, you certainly should. Other than it's another burden. You know, we already have first-generation low-income students who didn't grow up every night talking about college at the dinner table, who may not have the capacity or the resources to even understand how you apply to college, or certainly not get any help for it. We know we have students who fill out their application at a computer in one sitting. We've had students in the past who have told us, you know, I didn't know why I needed to write an essay, so I just typed something for you. And, you know, you contrast that with the stress that process causes other people, other students in the process. And so they already don't understand the whys and the hows of college and the intricacies and the ins and outs of it. And you throw another roadblock in their way, and it really can be a barrier to education. Again, Eric's absolutely right. There's good reason for it, and every taxpayer wants to make sure your money's not being wasted. But there are certainly other areas, I think, where the Department of Education and others could look if they wanted to cut waste in higher education and expenditures.
Yeah, I think it's always been verification has always had a negative connotation with me, just because of the students that I work with. Again, you know, about half of my student body is being selected for federal verification, which is, to me, is kind of crazy. But it's just as Eric said. I mean, it's the message that it sends, and almost to every student, they think it's the college putting these restrictions on them. Right. And they think that we're trying to put up another barrier for them to either enroll or maintain enrollment and achieve their dreams of getting a college education. And it's a very difficult conversation to have, to try to convince them, no, this is the federal government or this is the state that's requiring us to get this information from you. And students just don't get it, and it puts a very bad taste in a student's mouth from day one. And this is, a lot of this stuff happens pre-enrollment. And so, you know, you deal with melt because of these things. Students, again, as Eric's article pointed out, students will say, this is the straw that broke the camel's back, and higher education is obviously not for me. You know, when I was growing up, both my parents went to college. I came from a point of view of privilege for this particular issue, because if someone asked me for my parents' taxes, they would go into a shoebox into their closet and pull out their taxes. But it's not that simple for students today, particularly students that are low income, students that have parents, a splintered household, they have single parents, there's you know, custody rights, there's all kinds of red tape that they have to kind of navigate through, and students do not know how to ask the right questions, and parents have never been asked these questions before. So it becomes almost an impossible situation to try to work the students through. And keep in mind, you have to do this in a timely manner, because there's going to be federal deadlines, there's going to be state deadlines, and ultimately you pass those deadlines and that student is not going to get the aid that they're eligible for. So I just think it's one of those topics that needs to be constantly talked about until there's reform, and at least we get a little bit more flexibility on the institution side to be able to help these students through the processes. And we can have a whole other, you know, show about that. And I just tweeted out the article that Eric wrote, and I do encourage everybody to read that. This is definitely jumping over to a whole nother topic, but we did get a ton of questions about self-reporting data in the admissions world, and how that's obviously an increasing trend. My institution does not handle self-reporting data, so certainly, John, I want to turn it over to you and to see, you know, what are you hearing out in the industry about self-reporting data, and how does that influence college access?
Yeah, a lot of colleges and universities have been allowing students to self-report grades, a quasi-transcript, I guess, for a long time, and it seems to have worked really well for them. There are very few incidents of fraud. There may be mistakes, but not intentional fraud on the part of students. And so when you look at the fees that College Board and ACT charge students who are simply attempting to have another copy of the test scores sent to the colleges they're applying to, they're pretty substantial, especially for families who might be minimum wage families or even low income families. I think it's, if I recall, I don't do this every day, $13 to send another score report from ACT and something similar for the College Board. And so if something as simple as sending those test results is a barrier, people have started asking, is there a way to knock that down? And it's a very simple process. Students simply type their test scores onto the Common App or the application while they're doing it. The reviewer who's looking at the application treats that with good faith. If the student's admitted and then enrolls, he or she simply has to verify that via one official score send as opposed to multiple. And so I think it's a great idea. College Board and ACT have just come out in the past couple of weeks and are saying that they'll give much greater flexibility and leeway to students who qualify for fee waivers to take the test. And the number of score reports that they'll be able to send for free has been increased. And College Board also did the same thing with profile. So if you qualify for fee waivers through College Board, your profile fees are, are waived as well. And I think it's a great idea. I don't know why we haven't been doing it all along. It seems to be one of those feel-good stories that everything's coming together. We decided not to do it this year, but we'll almost certainly be participating in that next year. It was just a process and a labor and a time commitment issue for us at this point.
Awesome. Thank you for that. That's certainly something that I need to look at on my campus as well. We did get some amazing questions from Twitter. They're rolling in for you guys, and I'm trying to sort through them all and not get distracted by John Stein that he's drinking out of while we're talking here, appropriately enough. But Jen Ann Aquino had a great question.
It's just water. Honest, I swear. Yeah.
But Jen Ann Aquino follows Higher Ed Live on Twitter. She had a great question, and I think I'm just going to add a little bit to it, and that is, how can we help students understand what fit really means? And I know this is a loaded question, and how to find the right institution among the thousands of options out there. And I also want to kind of add to that for you guys is what is the role of college rankings and how it is pushing students, maybe in some cases, to the incorrect institution for them?
Well,
go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I recently suggested on Twitter that I believe it was a small piece I wrote in the New York Times that had the headline put on it, 10 tips for finding your perfect fit college, and I had to respond. I didn't write that headline, with all due respect to the Times. My response to that was, the 11th tip is to stop thinking that there is a perfect fit college. I think certainly a student having a handful of things in mind, a short list of what they want, and perhaps most important, what they don't want from their college experience can certainly be a useful set of questions to guide you. But the notion of this kind of glass slipper, this one college that's for me, I think is more often than not problematic, if not downright harmful, because I think it just puts, if you're putting all your eggs in this one basket, especially if you're talking about a super selective school that's probably going to reject you anyway, it's just not a healthy way to think about it. So I guess I would just start there and saying that if you're thinking of fit only in terms of one or two variables, you got to have a three-dimensional kind of understanding of what fit means. At least most families do, unless you're just super wealthy. You've got to include your family finances in the question of fit, which I think, in my experience, talking to families as they go through the selection process, fit is often a financial fit. That is, it's often something that comes in kind of at the 11th hour instead of, early on in the process. So I would start there by kind of doing away with the notion of anything close to a one perfect fit school for you.
Yeah, so Frank Sachs, who is the person that allegedly came up with the phrase "college is not a prize to be won, but a match to be made," was probably absolutely right when he said it at the time, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, or perhaps even longer. But I think some of us in the profession have come to believe that the concept of fit is a luxury reserved for students from the very top echelons of the income brackets in America, in the sense that college doesn't cost the same for everybody at every place anymore. There are dramatically different patterns to financial aid and how much aid students get at different institutions. And so the old idea that every college would, after financial aid, cost the same, and you were then free to choose a college based on all those personality traits and characteristics and academic programs and lovely leaves in the fall and the things that you thought were important, has sort of become less important. And for a lot of students, it's not, can I find the perfect college for me, but can I find any college that I can afford? And so while it's nice to have several options and to be able to make discernments and discriminations on very fine points, it's a lot easier to do that when your parents can write a check to any of your choice institutions. It's not so easy when you need financial aid and you need to worry about how you're going to pay for tuition your second semester, let alone your first semester. So it's still an interesting concept, and I think there's some validity to it, saying that if you're a person, for instance, who likes a lot of close personal attention in your academic endeavors, you might not want to think about a big state institution where you're going to be in lecture hall with 600 students. Conversely, if you like to be anonymous, you probably shouldn't go to a small liberal arts college where you'll be in a class with 12 students. And so from that angle, fit and matching makes a lot of sense. But I think it's a concept that's sort of falling by the wayside these days and really reserved for a select few students in the country.
That's really interesting, John. I think we're misusing the term then. I still think this idea of fit is being talked about in every admissions office, in the country. We have to find the right students that are the right fit for us. But you may be 100% correct, particularly an institution that's working with some low-income students. I mean, it might not have a choice. Right. So it might be just a failed strategy on the part of institutions in terms of kind of making sure they're defining who they are and what they want to be and how they want to be marketed as it relates to fit, because it might not be a dynamic that's appropriate anymore. But I think this is kind of lends itself to a discussion, and kind of part two of what I want to talk about is this idea of promoting college choice in the media. And obviously we have the perfect person to kind of help us through that. But, right now on Twitter, and I love him more than, trust me, I love him as much as anybody else, but I love the videos about the students going into their portal, checking their dream school, getting in, the families go crazy, the school goes crazy, they're all wearing their Columbia, Harvard, or whatever sweatshirt, and they knew that was going to happen. It was going to happen for them. You never see those videos for a mid-tier, institution or a small liberal arts college that's non-selective. So are we doing this to ourselves when we talk about fit? And is the kind of national narrative of college admissions and fit and whatever we want to talk about being driven by only a handful of schools, because those are the schools that drive kind of the news cycle in higher ed? Eric, please, this is all you.
Yes, those schools by and large do drive coverage at mainstream newspapers, general interest newspapers. Why is that? People ask me all the time. I mean, one theory is that many journalists, many reporters and editors went to schools like that, and by that I mean, you pick your number, the 30 or 12 most famous, most selected. I think there's a widespread perception that is what the readership wants, and I think some newspapers, I've seen some of these numbers at a couple of very large famous newspapers. I mean, they do have numbers that they can use to tell them that yes, when we write a story about, let me pick a name out of a hat, Harvard, that those stories get a tremendous amount of readership relative to stories about other things. I mean, if I'll just get in trouble for saying this. If I never write a story about an Ivy League institution again, I won't feel like my life is hollow as a result. But yes, I do think if you think of these major super selective colleges as kind of like brands, you know, as national kind of corporations, just like as you would find in any other industry, you're going to see a front page story about Walmart. You know, in the Washington Post next week, you're not probably going to see the same kind of coverage of like a regional chain necessarily. I think there's just a lot of, there's a strong sense that this is what some core group of the newspaper buying public or newspaper consuming public now really wants. And so, I mean, I can see why this is a major frustration for folks in higher ed.
Yeah, some people think this is a problem of our national organizations and think that NACAC and NASFA and ACRO and JACAC and all those organizations should do something about this. And you know, we really know that this is a societal problem and a media problem, and we blame the journalists for it. Right, Eric?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think journalists often have a role in it. I don't know if it's so much, to be fair to all the many fine reporters who work at mainstream papers that often tend to focus on those schools. I'm not necessarily convinced that any of those journalists are obsessed with those institutions necessarily. But sometimes your editor tells you, no, this is who we're going to focus on. This is who is making news. I probably get a question or two a month from representatives of smaller colleges, from regional publics, asking me for advice on how to get the institution on the front page of a local, regional, or even national newspaper. I don't always know what to tell them, to be honest. You know, find a compelling story and try to link it to a national trend. But I do think it's an uphill climb, especially now when it's a fact. You have fewer and fewer people who can say they are education journalists. Throughout journalism, particularly higher ed journalists. I mean, we're kind of a dying breed, to be honest, and I think that's part of the story here too.
Yeah, I still like blame the journalists always. That's always a good thing to fall back on.
That's really easy anyway, nice and tidy. So I mean, I think a really good example of this, and we just tweeted out the feature, but the New York Times did a feature on the Quality of Opportunity Project study a while back, and I'm not sure if you guys are familiar, but it was a very in-depth study. You know, they looked at tens of thousands of tax transcripts to see what institutions are doing a good job with the lowest income students and moving them up income quintiles. And the way the study was framed in the write-up in the New York Times was the Ivies are failing in this regard. They're not bringing enough low-income students, and the low-income students that they are bringing in aren't necessarily you know, their life isn't necessarily changing because they were enrolled at an Ivy League institution or elite institution. But there's a whole other narrative on the side of that, my institution being one, that was very frustrating, where you have these colleges that are dealing almost primarily with a low-income student and moving them consistently up into the middle class and past the middle class, and that gets very little or no coverage. And then try putting that study on a billboard. You know, at a school like Bloomfield College, you know, we're trying to tell students that, you know, we take the lowest economic quintile and move you up at least 2 or more quintiles at a higher rate than, you know, we're ranked 20th in the nation in that. You know, I've tried to put that on, you know, a digital advertising campaign for the last year and a half, and I can't figure out the wording that would be appropriate. But you just kind of get caught up in that web, and it just, you know, clicks are driving coverage. And I think, you know, this is not a higher ed thing. This is obviously, you know, a mainstream media issue. But I think in terms of, and John, you brought up the national organizations and how we have this discussion, particularly with school counselors, I think, to kind of make sure they're doing as much as they possibly can to kind of drive college choice may help. And it very, very well may have to be an organic kind of movement, and it may be impossible to overcome, you know, mainstream media to help promote college choice, but it may be something that we have to dedicate ourselves to.
Yeah, there's a cell phone company in the United States that spends over $2 billion a year in advertising, and we just don't have that sort of opportunity to affect public impression and public discourse the way big organizations do.
Yep. No, I think it's as simple as that. I do want to talk about, Eric, last year you wrote a very interesting article entitled "The Enrollment Manager as Boogeyman." And my guess is not much has changed since you penned that article last year. Can you give us kind of your thoughts on an update, a 2017 update on that article, and where do you see the trends are for individuals in this profession?
Yeah, well, someone wrote me this morning pointing out that it should also be enrollment manager as boogie woman, that there are more and more women at the rising to the top levels of your profession. So I wanted to note that. I'm in Washington, D.C., which you might is many things, and one of them is it's kind of a fertile ground for folks who, I don't know, work in policy circles, work at think tanks, who really do have their knives out for people in Jon's field in general, and your field in general, Adam, but also for Jon in particular, I think. And Jon has dealt with some of them on social media recently. I think some of it comes from maybe a good place, right? A concern about how the tactics, strategies a college embraces, particularly on the recruitment and financial aid side. How do these policies impact a whole host of folks, particularly students who are the most vulnerable, right? I mean, I think that's a good question and concern to take with you as you are peering into the complexity of enrollment management. But I think after that point, there's often kind of a failure of understanding or failure of imagination when it comes to at least a good deal of the criticism of the field. And I think some of it just founders on a lack of understanding of those complexities that you, Adam, and Jon deal with every day. So since I wrote that piece, do I detect any kind of sea change among the folks who are skeptical, if not downright critical, of enrollment management? No, I think some people don't acknowledge the complexity of the work that folks are doing, especially outside of a small handful of lucky institutions who are blessed with considerable wealth, and whose conception of the bottom line certainly looks a lot different than it does at most institutions where applicants aren't incredibly abundant and resources, any kind of resources, are scarce. So I think this is probably, in 10 years, if we all got together, this is still kind of a perception problem that enrollment folks are still dealing with. Jon, I don't know if you have thoughts on how folks in your chair might be able to help with this, educate folks. Is there a grassroots public relations campaign that enrollment folks need to engage in?
I wish there were something we could do. I think the problem is that everybody's interested in this topic, and very few people have the in-depth knowledge that it takes to dissect it and make sense of the data or the information they see. And something as simple as a journalist looking at the term need-based and merit-based aid and drawing a line in the sand and saying financial aid is either one or the other, and it's based on this ridiculous government formula, just strikes me as almost absurd. And I'm trying to make some sense of how an institution puts a class together and how it uses limited and scarce financial resources to try to meet all the objectives everybody at the university is looking for, is really a lot more complex than that. And I often, when I'm talking to journalists, I say, you know, I'm very interested in nuclear power, but I'm not going to watch the guy sit at the power board for 10 minutes and tell him how to do his job or tell him what he did wrong, because there are nuances and there are, you know, intricacies in the profession that I just don't understand. But with a blog and a cheap PC, anybody can have an opinion and anybody can put it on the internet. And you know, I do the same thing in higher education. I have a couple blogs, and I'm glad they're there. It's just when those gain some currency and become part of the so-called conventional wisdom that I think we have some problems.
But are we losing, because of this thought process, are we losing some of the best and brightest minds and, you know, the people with potential in this field that can do great work in the future because there's this little bit of a negative connotation when you have enough evidence to write an article entitled, you know, Enrollment Management as a Boogeyman? You can believe that a 29-year-old, you know, associate director of admission with grand career plans may rethink their career path at that time. So
Sure.
Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that's a great question, Adam, but I guess I would just say it's not just like a perception problem. I mean, I've interviewed many folks who are still in the field on the college side, but who have decided after great thought that they don't want to move up and have a job like yours, partly because they don't actually, it's not just the perception of what the job is, they don't like the reality of it. And there's certainly many folks who leave admissions as they move up the ladder or enrollment and go do something else, or they go to the other side of the desk and work in counseling. And I think, sure, there is a misperception problem, I think, for your field. I also think that the actual reality of the work itself, with all due respect, I think does drive some people out. Some people don't want to interact with data in the way that maybe the two of you are adept at doing. Some of them don't want to be managing so many kind of institutional trade-offs. I think that the actual experience, right, the existence of being senior level admissions or enrollment person, given all the demands and its complexity, it's some people's cup of tea, but I think that reality does nudge out people who got into the field on the front end for different kinds of reasons to exercise different kinds of skills. Not to say someone can't have them all or many of them, but I do think that the intense pressures of that job and all the folks that you have to answer to, perhaps daily. Some people really love higher ed and love the field and leave it with all due respect, but think, gosh, that's not for me. It's too much. I think that's a real problem too.
Yeah, and I think the root of the issue is that we hire people in admissions who have not exactly opposite skills, but complementary skills to the people that you need to do enrollment management, or the skills that you need to do enrollment management. And so, as Eric said, I think there is some disillusionment when you find out that what you got into the profession for is not what happens when you move farther up the organizational chart at the university, that there are different expectations, different demands, and they require you to look at problems and the whole system differently.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, I think as enrollment managers, we always prided ourselves on, and certainly I did it, particularly earlier in my career, is the ability to kind of grow your coaching tree, right? It's, you move people up. And sometimes they move out to bigger and better things. And that was a feather in your cap. And now we're seeing a lot more, Eric, as you alluded to, a lot more people perfectly fine at a mid-level position because they get to do the recruitment, they get to do the counseling, and they don't necessarily want to move up anymore. So it's been tough for me personally to kind of gauge that and make sure it's not a reflection on anything that I'm doing as I try to cultivate the staff that's working in my department kind of going forward. We are running out of time, guys. This has absolutely flew by, but I definitely want to save just a couple minutes here to kind of get both your ideas on what is coming in 2018, particularly as a result, as it lends to challenges we see for this field. Jon, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I would say with Republicans in control of all three branches of government, that our orientation toward financial aid is unlikely to get better and may get worse. And for tuition-driven institutions especially, I think it's ultimately really bad news. I'm not optimistic about what federal and even state financial aid programs will look like next year or 2 years down the road.
Amen. Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I would second that. I mean, I think that's where the rubber hits the road for institutions as well as students. What does your institutional pocketbook look like? What does your family treasury look like? I mean, this is the big issue right now. It'll be the big issue next year and in 5 years. I mean, and then just a small aside. I mean, I'm in touch with a couple of prominent institutions who we'll see what actually happens, but are I think carefully combing through their admissions policies, including taking a second or third look, a hard look anyway, at legacies. That's just one small piece of the admissions puzzle. Maybe on some campuses, not such a small piece, but again, a small thing that reminds us of a bigger question: who are we admitting, and why, and what are the different kind of subgroups or buckets that are someone's hook or way in? I think at least a couple of prominent institutions are refreshingly telling me anyway that they are maybe second guessing how and why they do certain things. I'd look for stories about that in the next few months.
I think Eric just scooped us and said there's going to be an Ivy League institution going test optional next year. Is that right, Eric?
I keep hearing that, but I don't see evidence of it. But
okay, we'll see.
We shall see. Well, I think we can certainly end on that note. Gentlemen, this was amazing. We might have to turn this into kind of an annual thing. We can wrap up the year in grand fashion. But I definitely want you, certainly, guys, if you could tell the audience where they can find you on social media, on Twitter, and certainly on the web. Jon, please.
Sure. So my first name is Jon, and just go to jon.social, and you'll be connected to all my social media accounts, personal and professional.
Okay, and you have an amazing blog as well. Please plug that as well.
And they're linked on those that page. So if you go to jon.social, you'll find everything about me you need to find out.
Great. Eric?
Okay, so I'm Eric Hoover, ric.hoover at chronicle.com. I'm at Eric Hoove, ERICHOOV, on Twitter. You can go to the Chronicle and Google my name, Google Eric Hoover and Animal House. Good story. You know, until I start the Journalists Association for College Admission Counseling, JACAC, you know, to help new and aspiring higher ed writers learn what I've been lucky enough to learn over 16 years of the Chronicle. You know, those are the ways to reach me. Feel free to do that anytime.
All right, thanks, gentlemen. Thank you, as always, to M. Stoner. You make us go. A big thank you also goes out to our program sponsor for today, NRCCUA. Gentlemen, let's do this again. Thank you so much for joining us on Admissions Live today.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Best wishes in 2018, guys. Cheers.
You too. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.